Welcome to episode 194 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about John Coltrane's release from 1960, which, spoiler, is pretty good, Giant Steps. And what I have here is a 2017 re-release on Atlantic, and that, of course, was the label it originally came out on. The mono re-release from this year is kind of a mixed blessing, I guess. It's wonderfully clear and well packaged and well executed. The piano and the bass are a little bit muffled at times, and from everything I understand, that has more to do with the original mono mix than it has to do with that particular pressing. This recording captures Coltrane in the spring of 1959, after he has just done that fantastic record with Miles Davis and Bill Evans and Cannonball and others, Kind of Blue. Although these sessions come hot on the heels of that recording, is a very different feel. This is not cool at all. It's much more exuberant. Musically and technically, it's spectacular, and it reveals how far Coltrane had come in the 2 years that he'd spent first with Monk and then with Davis since he'd gotten clean. He's exploding with ideas. His sidemen are struggling to keep up with him, and that's not just a figurative comment, because in these sessions he goes through 3 piano players and 3 drummers, all in the search to try and find the right fit. Very much his own show. I've discussed John Coltrane's late 1950s arc in greater detail in other reviews. Short version is, he plays with Miles Davis from 1955 to early 1957, at which point his heroin habit is starting to get the better of him. Miles is noticing this. He's had a few set twos with Coltrane about this, eventually fires him that April. Coltrane goes back to Philadelphia. In a month, he gets clean, comes back to New York. With his life back in the rails in the latter part of 1957, he starts recording as a leader for Prestige. But probably more significantly for his own development, he also at this time accepts an offer from Thelonious Monk to join him in a 6-month-long engagement from July through December 1957 at the 5 Spot in the Village, which was kind of this beat hangout. Monk, who of course was one of the founders of the bebop revolution and a complete original, was back from his own kind of exile at the time. In 1951, he'd refused to testify against the famous pianist Bud Powell in a heroin possession charge, and as a consequence of that, the NYPD had yanked his cabaret card. Monk had been in the wilderness for 6 years at this point. He's finally back and able to play, and he takes his 6-month engagement at the 5 Spot. This is a key period of development for Coltrane, who was super interested in musical theory and experimentation, coming at things from a different angle. Davis never wanted to discuss music outside of the studio or off the stage. Monk was totally the opposite, and Coltrane and Monk spent all kinds of time together, bouncing ideas off each other and then playing those ideas out on stage. Those dates at the 5 Spot are legendary. Sadly, there's only a few recordings, but they're phenomenal recordings. Amongst the rest of the world, Miles Davis takes note that Coltrane is back, and in the beginning of 1958, once this engagement with Monk is over, he invites him back into his quintet. In his second stint with Davis, Coltrane, of course, participates in some fantastic recordings with that group, but he also progresses by leaps and bounds on his own records, and from this point on, there's no mistaking him for anybody else. He's completely distinctive. There's lots that you can read about the musical innovations that Coltrane was pursuing at the time, probably no better place than in Lewis Porter's biography, on which I'm drawing fairly extensively in this discussion. Fantastic book. I'm not a serious musician in any way, and so I don't really have the chops to speak about the technical details with any authority. What I will say is that Coltrane was heavily invested at this time in taking unusual approaches to relatively conventional chords and chord structures. Interestingly, and maybe a coincidence, maybe not, at the same time that Coltrane is conducting maybe his most significant experimentation with chords and chord changes, Davis, for his part, just weeks before, on a record that Coltrane had played on, is basically throwing chord progressions right out the window. Coltrane's first try at recording the songs in this record occurs on March 26, 1957. He uses a slightly different lineup. He uses Paul Chambers on bass, as he always would, but there are 2 other players on that session that don't appear here, Lex Humphreys on drums and the piano player Cedar Walton. He'd played gigs around this time with Walton and Humphreys to prepare for the sessions, and he and Walton had actually set aside rehearsal time to work through some of the numbers. But when Humphreys and Chambers come in for the recording sessions, things just don't work out. The songs are much slower, the endings aren't working, Coltrane gets frustrated, and those all basically go in the bin, although they were released, those outtakes, in '74 and again more comprehensively in around 1995 by Atlantic, so you can hear all those earlier sessions as well. What's clear in those dates is an issue which would also kind of dog these sessions, which is that the sidemen were struggling to keep up with Coltrane, who was on an absolute technical tear at this point. Walton in particular was really struggling to keep up, lots of fumbles and bumbles, and he didn't take any solos in the outtakes. Coltrane was never giving him the nod because it just wasn't really at the races. Coltrane has another go at making this record about 5 weeks later on May 4th and 5th, and he brings in Tommy Flanagan on piano instead of Walton. Flanagan had no idea it was take two. He and Coltrane had met a few months previously. They played together on a record called The Cats in April, and on those sessions, Coltrane was very impressed with Flanagan's ear, his ability to lock in with Coltrane, and Coltrane started calling him the maestro. They went back into Atlantic Studios, the relatively new studios at 60th, after the Ertegun brothers had moved from their old digs at 56th and Broadway to slightly swankier digs just the other side of Columbus Circle. The producer is Nasui Ertegun. Coltrane, of course, is on tenor, and all 7 compositions are by him. Paul Chambers is on bass. Chambers, of course, was his bandmate with Miles Davis, and Chambers was also Coltrane's go-to bassist on anything he recorded as a leader around this time because he had huge respect for his technical ability. And Art Taylor joins on drums. On those 2 days in the studio, they laid down 6 of the 7 tracks in this record. The only one that's not recorded at that time is Naima, which of course is named for his wife. That's recorded on December 2nd, and for that session, Coltrane brings in all of the rhythm section from the Davis group, including, of course, Chambers, Jimmy Cobb on drums, and Wynton Kelly on piano. When the record was finished, and you can tell this from the liner notes, Coltrane was pretty unsure what he'd achieved. He expresses concern that what he was trying to do was too technical, too academic, that basically he spent all his energy trying to take these academic jazz, musicological kinds of ideas and make them lyrical in the lines he was writing. It's released in February 1960, and it was acclaimed then and is acclaimed now as a masterpiece. The record starts with the famous track Giant Steps, and that begins with that famous descending, slightly discordant line in the head arrangement, and then Coltrane is away, like he's possessed with some kind of superhuman spirit. It's joyous, it's energetic, it's robust, everybody else is trying to keep up. After his solo, then Flanagan comes in a very different feeling kind of solo. It's laconic, it's laid back. Apparently, just like Walton before, Flanagan had had huge difficulties with this track, which is played at a breakneck pace. All kinds of stumbles in the outtakes, which you can hear on some of those later releases. Eventually, he just plays his way through it fairly slowly. I think what you hear is actually the sounds of a man working through trauma. Cousin Mary is the next track. If it's not as fast, it must be close. Very different feel, though. It's more bluesy, less joyful, almost more nightlifey, if that makes any sense. Countdown is next. It's a short little track. Coltrane's not letting up, though. Taylor starts on drums, and then Coltrane comes in, just ripping, just like he was in the very first track. Apparently, this song is something like 300 beats a minute, and it's an absolutely breakneck pace. Eventually, Flanagan and Chambers come in as well. It's just an incredible piece of music, and I guess Coltrane knew what was coming because he'd taken Taylor aside to rehearse this particular track a few days before, and you can see why. The final track on side 1 is Spiral, and unlike the Speed Merchant exhibition's first 3 tracks, this is pretty bluesy. It's probably the swingingest number, maybe on the whole record. It's not as technical as some of the other songs, but it's probably the most fun of the 4 tracks on side 1. It's the one that makes you feel like you're in a club. Side 2 starts with Saida's song flute, and Saida, of course, was Coltrane's daughter. This, you can tell, has got a lot of Monk influence in the playfulness, and it wouldn't have been out of place, actually, frankly, on a Monk record. It swings really hard, and it has some classic Coltrane moments in his solo, by which I mean those times when he basically takes the same relatively simple musical expression, and he comes at it from almost every angle, the same 5 or 6 notes. Very characteristic. Coltrane's well-known ballad Naima is next. This is a song which Coltrane felt was maybe his best composition. Again, you can debate that, but if we're talking single tracks as opposed to a suite like A Love Supreme, I think he's got a point. At this stage of the record, it's a welcome change of pace. This is not about sheets of sound, it's not about technical excellence, it's sparse and it's spacious. The final track in the album, we return to faster tempos with Mr. PC, which is dedicated to Paul Chambers. This is a rapid-fire 12-bar blues. It's another track which swings really hard, and there's some incredible playing by the title player, I guess, Paul Chambers, which you can hear best in the way that he underpins Flanagan's solo. As most folks tend to conclude, this is one of Coltrane's best records. Along with My Favorite Things, it's also probably the peak of him pushing to do everything he could do within the conventional world of hard bop. In other moments immediately surrounding this record, he's actually trying very different things. There's the whole modal revolution with Miles Davis and Bill Evans that's happening on Kind of Blue. His live performances, too, at this time, and then increasingly with the work he would do with Eric Dolphy, began to severely test his relationships with critics and with listeners because they were pretty out there. But this is still very much within what people expected jazz to be at the time. But if the form was to be expected, the results were absolutely mind-blowing. And as ever with Coltrane, when he's got something to push against, you almost get better outcomes. It's a timeless record. It's full of a kind of carefree joy which would be replaced by other sorts of emotions on other records. It's musically complex, it's always rewarding, and I gotta give it 5 out of 5.